The following episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television. Good morning, USA, and welcome to another episode of the Bernie or Bust Show. Here we are on the day of the South Carolina primaries. Today we're going to wrap up a few ideas from earlier in the week, and then we're going to implore you to continue on the Bernie or Bust path to victory. We'll begin with an article by Matt Taibbi. Russia isn't dividing us, our leaders are. A last-ditch effort to derail the Sanders campaign fails as voters finally reject the Russia con. The latest act in the comedy began Friday, just before voting opened in the Nevada Democratic caucus. The Washington Post ran a story sourced, I'm not joking, to people familiar with the matter, explaining that Bernie Sanders had been briefed that Russia is attempting to help his presidential campaign as part of an effort to interfere with the Democratic contest. Sanders was quick to see through the gambit. I'll let you guess about one day before the Nevada caucus. Why do you think it came out? He pointed to a Post reporter. It was the Washington Post. Good friends. The Post, after all, has spent years dumping on Sanders, a fervent critic of the paper's billionaire creep of an owner, Jeff Bezos. Intelligence officials and pundits have been screeching for years. Let me stop and say it's interesting that Matt conflates intelligence officials and pundits. That's not a tinfoil hat idea to put intelligence officials and pundits in the same sentence. Intelligence officials and pundits have been screeching for years that patriotism demands voters reject the foreign agent Donald Trump and the Russian asset Bernie Sanders and support a conventional establishment politician. Voters responded by moving toward Trump in national approval surveys and speeding Sanders to the top of the Democratic Party ticket. A more thorough disavowal of official propaganda would be difficult to imagine. Russiagate will soon be 4 years old. For the first 3 years, it pushed parallel themes that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election and Trump conspired in the fraud. The latter theme at times garnered literal around-the-clock coverage. CNN and MSNBC especially, but also the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Beast, and other major outlets preached to audiences that the fall of the Trump administration was imminent. Special prosecutor Robert Mueller, news audiences were told, would reveal the Trump-Russia conspiracy and save the world. After this story died a violent death when Mueller's probe ended with no new charges, conventional wisdom shifted to a new gospel. Russiagate was about foreign interference. Russiagate from the start smelled funny, like bad food. Multiple developments worsened the odor. Stories kept coming up wrong. There were too many unnamed sources, too frequently contradicting each other and or overstating facts. Every hoof print was a zebra's. Outlets stopped worrying about relaying unconfirmed rumors, which is how terms like blackmail, Trump, Russia, and even golden showers kept appearing in headlines without proof there ever had been blackmail. Moreover, while ordinary citizens like Reality Winner went straight to jail for leaking, senior government officials in the last 4 years repeatedly and with impunity leaked Russia-related tales. The leaks often pushed still more incorrect narratives, like for instance that the Trump aide Carter Page was a foreign agent. But the biggest red flag of all was the way in which Russia over the last few years became shorthand to describe any brand of political deviance. I wrote this 2 years ago. Since Trump's election, we've been told Putin was all or partly behind the lot of it. The Catalan independence movement, the Sanders campaign, Brexit, Jill Stein's Green Party run, Black Lives Matter, the resignations of intra-party Trump critics Bob Corker and Jeff Flake. Unnamed officials have since added the Corbyn movement in England, the Gilets jaunes, yellow vest protesters in Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, militias in Africa, pro-government disinformation campaigns in Hong Kong, the presidential campaign of Tulsi Gabbard, and countless other undesirables to what has amounted to an ongoing, cumulative blacklist. The extraordinary thing about this campaign to identify basically the entire universe of political thought outside of establishment Democrats in the US as Russian assets has been the obvious projection involved. The plot running through all these stories has been the idea that Russia is trying to undermine our democracy by sowing division, But these charges are coming from the same people who spent the last 4 years describing Republicans as deplorable fascists and progressives on the other side as racist, sexist, Nazis, and digital brown shirts. Thank you, Chuck Todd, for that. This has resulted in a 4-year parade of official cranks muttering about Russian efforts to divide us when their own relentless message has been that America is besieged by a pair of Hitlerian movements on the left and right that must be put down at all costs. The only vision of unity they promote is one of obedience to the crackpot anti-utopia of neoliberalism that populations around the world are currently rejecting at the ballot box, not to mention protests in the streets. The core of the argument about Russian interference rested upon two major news stories: the hack of the DNC in 2016 and a campaign by the Internet Research Agency to push divisive social media content. The former is a leak of true information about the correspondence of senior Democratic Party officials. Jeremy Corbyn was similarly accused of abetting Russian disinformation efforts when damning but real materials about the British National Health Service were leaked. The latter, a story about a group of silly memes amplified 1 billion-fold by the American commercial news reports about these same efforts. Did the Russians actually do these things? Maybe. It's not confirmed either way. The sourcing even today remains tied to the same people who've lied about 1,000 other things, both in the course of this story and before, from WMDs to the missile gap. As we saw this week, when officials quietly began admitting their ideas about what Russia wants rested on perhaps overstated interpretations of intelligence, many of these narratives have been elaborate exercises in reading tea leaves, and they won't let us see the tea leaves. I'll let you read the rest of this article, but suffice it to say that this is just one prong of a multi-pronged attack to derail the Bernie Sanders train. Here's a new piece by Tulsi Gabbard. Presidential candidates must also condemn election interference by U.S. intelligence agencies. Reckless claims by anonymous intelligence officials that Russia is helping Senator Bernie Sanders are deeply irresponsible. So is former New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg's calculated decision Tuesday to repeat this unsubstantiated accusation on the debate stage in South Carolina. Enough is enough. I'm calling on all presidential candidates to stop playing these dangerous political games and immediately condemn any interference in our elections by out-of-control intelligence agencies. A, quote, news article published last week in the Washington Post, which set off yet another manufactured media firestorm, alleges that the goal of Russia is to trick people into criticizing establishment Democrats. This is a laughably obvious ploy to stifle legitimate criticism and cast aspersions on Americans who are rightly skeptical of the powerful forces exerting control over the primary election process. We are told the aim of Russia is to sow division, but the aim of corporate media and self-serving politicians pushing this narrative is clearly to sow division of their own by generating baseless suspicion against the Sanders campaign. It's extremely disingenuous for journalists, in quotes again, and rival candidates to publicize a news article that merely asserts, without presenting any evidence, that Russia is helping Bernie Sanders, but provides no information as to what that help allegedly consists of. The American people have the right to know this information in order to put Russia's alleged interference into proper perspective. It is a mystery why the intelligence community would want to hide these details from us. Instead, they are relying on highly dubious and vague insinuations filtered through their preferred media outlets, which seem designed to create a panic rather than actually inform the public about a genuine threat. All this does is undermine voters' trust in our elections, which is what we are constantly told is the goal of Russia. If the CIA, FBI, or any other intelligence agency is going to tell voters that Russians are interfering in this election to help certain candidates or simply sow discord, then they need to immediately provide us with the details of what exactly they're alleging. Otherwise, all they are doing is fomenting a sense of powerlessness and paranoia in the voting public, which could suppress engagement in the electoral process. And, at least according to the anonymous officials speaking menacingly to the media, that is precisely what Russia wants. If our political leaders and those in the media were really concerned with protecting the integrity of our elections from outside manipulation, instead of just making money from manufactured hysteria, They would presumably devote more coverage to proposals to institute backup paper ballots, which would ensure that no malicious actors can ever alter our votes or hack into our election infrastructure. The bill I reintroduced last year, the Securing America's Elections Act, does exactly that, but the media has never shown much interest because it would not generate the so-called bombshell headlines they so desperately crave. The FBI, CIA, or any other intelligence agency should immediately stop smearing presidential candidates with innuendo and vague evidence-free assertions. That is antithetical to their role in a free democracy. The American people cannot have faith in our intelligence agencies if they are pushing an agenda to harm candidates they dislike. Any attempts to keep the American people quiet, with the threat that if they dare criticize the Democratic Party establishment, they will be labeled hostile foreign agents, are unacceptable and disgraceful. This new McCarthyism must be renounced by every presidential candidate, otherwise we must conclude they lack the foresight and integrity required to lead our country. If candidates are too afraid to stand up against those who would suppress the voices of the American people with McCarthyist smears, they are not real leaders. They are just power-hungry, self-serving politicians whose goal is to play act as president rather than actually defend the freedoms enshrined in our Constitution. It is now clear that the mainstream corporate media and the warmongering political establishment are seeking to do two things. Number one, create enough suspicion around Sanders by falsely tarnishing him as a puppet of Russia that he loses the election. Two, or at the very least, if Bernie wins the Democratic nomination, force him to engage in inflammatory anti-Russia rhetoric and perpetuate the new Cold War and nuclear arms race, which are existential threats to our country and the world. That strategy worked very well with Trump. Trump has spent his entire presidency trying to prove to the media that he is not Putin's puppet by carrying out extremely aggressive policies that have brought us closer to nuclear war with Russia than we have been in decades. If Sanders is the Democratic nominee, the corporate media will do everything they can to turn the general election into a contest of who is going to be tougher on Russia. This tactic is necessary to propagandize the American people into shelling over their hard-earned tax dollars to the Pentagon to fund the highly lucrative nuclear arms race that military-industrial complex craves. In the most recent appropriations bill last year, the Pentagon was handed $738 billion, which includes a blank check for dangerous new nuclear warheads and destabilizing missile systems that increase the likelihood of catastrophic war with Russia. The question facing any potential Democratic nominee is this: am I going to allow myself to be manipulated and forced into a corner by overreaching intelligence agencies and the corporate media, where, in order for me to win the presidency, I'm going to have to do what I know is not in the interests of the American people and world peace? Or will I stand up to the corrupt neocon and neoliberal establishment, condemn their lies and smears, and act with the integrity and foresight necessary to forge a rational policy that will serve all our interests? The problem with President Trump is that he talks tough against the media and the intelligence agencies, but he was not strong enough to stand up to their pressure. He was cowed into trying to prove that he's not a puppet of Russia, and as a consequence, he has brought us closer and closer to nuclear war. The Democratic nominee cannot make the same mistake. Our country and the world are depending on it. So how does this angle work out when we're talking about Mike Bloomberg's candidacy?
As of this writing, the two Democratic frontrunners are Senator Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist, and a billionaire media mogul turned politician, Michael Bloomberg.
Which tax haven? New York City. Thank you.
This week's debate in Las Vegas was the first in which Bloomberg has actually taken part. Up until then, he let his money do the talking, spending more than $1/3 of $1 billion on advertising.
Bloomberg is the only Democrat who can take on Trump.
His face is what you see every time you turn on the television. If you're listening to the radio, if you're on the internet, Bloomberg all the time.
I like Mike. Mike. I like Mike. I like Mike. I like Mike. I like
And in a limited way, we've already seen its efficacy. Early signs are that he has absolutely annihilated the centrist moderate lane, and his only opponent at this point is Bernie Sanders.
Some people might say, don't hate the player, hate the game, but at the same time, our lives are not a game. I mean, this is reality, and we're allowing someone who is virtually unchecked to bypass process.
Mike will get it done.
Mike will get it done.
Mike will get it done.
Michael Bloomberg has been able to run ads and posts and engage influencers to make him seem like, the cool dad or granddad without actually having to be vetted on his actual record, on his issues. He's able to misinterpret and distort, and that is a problem.
And so it's a perfect example of how the U.S. democracy is so fragile in the sense that it doesn't represent the interests of the people, but in fact represents the interests of those people who have money.
And the people who receive it. The bulk of Bloomberg's ad spend is on television, filling the coffers of some of the networks covering him. The corporate media also seem to have a conflict of interest when covering Bernie Sanders,
You think?
who wants to rein in corporate power and raise taxes on the rich. The network taking the most heat for its Sanders coverage is MSNBC. MSNBC's politics are center-left, but with a capitalist C. It openly opposes Donald Trump, but constantly tells its viewers that the socialist Sanders, who keeps leading the polls, is unelectable.
Black voters said we would rather vote for the king of stop and frisk and gentrification than for Bernie's socialist revolution.
MSNBC's Stop Sanders campaign has irked many Democratic voters, previously undecided ones, one of whom said as much on MSNBC's air.
See, the reason I went for Bernie is because of MSNBC. The Stop Bernie cynicism that I heard from a number of people, it made me angry enough. I said, okay, Bernie's got my vote.
There is an ideological divide at play in MSNBC's coverage and a generational one.
That woman who said that MSNBC made her mad enough to vote for Bernie is also what fuels the Bernie or Bust movement. So if you feel the way she does, you know what to do. BernieOrBust2020.us. BernieOrBust2020.us. Take the Bernie or Bust pledge today.
I have my own views of the word socialist, and I'll be glad to share them with you in private.
Even though polls show that 40% of Americans, most of them young, have a positive view of socialism, the pundit class at MSNBC and anchors like Chris Matthews spit out the S word like it's radioactive.
I believe if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed. And
his vision of Bernie Sanders as this Stalin-esque figure who's going to bring back the gulags and executions in Central Park is completely off base. Bernie's message of democratic socialism is something that is more like what we see in a lot of European countries.
In the working out of a great national program.
And the great irony is we've seen it in the United States of America. It is very similar to the New Deal policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So when they say that Bernie Sanders is some crazy radical, no, what he's doing now is a more inclusive reboot of really the greatest economic movement in American history.
So can you see how it works? The red baiting is working in two ways. One angle is the one Tulsi is talking about, where you can make everyone afraid of election interference. And the other is broader. It's the Chris Matthews angle, which is trying to make everyone afraid of communism as it used to be a century ago. David hasn't been on for a while, but let's see what he says about Elizabeth Warren.
Most democracies around the world, the person who gets the most votes wins. How about we make America that kind of democracy?
What else is there to say here? And actually, I do have a little more to say. But in every part of that answer, Elizabeth Warren is lying or doesn't know, and is willfully ignorant of the actual fact. The actual fact that Bernie's play was to try and get superdelegates of states that he won, which should be how democracy works. Like this idea that you had, to go back to superdelegates in 2016 just for a second, you had the media reporting on delegates state by state as the primary was going through in 2016, reporting on delegates as if the superdelegates had already voted for Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton obviously had all the institutional support behind her. So the way that MSNBC, for example, would report after New Hampshire was to say, oh yes, Bernie won New Hampshire against Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton's still in the lead. And people are like, wait, how is that possible? It's because she had all these superdelegates on her side from the start. But back in 2015, like before Bernie even really got into the campaign, the superdelegates had already said that they would support Hillary Clinton. Now, the dishonest part about that is that you could the superdelegates had not voted yet, and they could easily flip their support from Hillary to somebody else, as they did in 2008, when at the beginning of the primary against Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton had the majority of superdelegates until they moved to Barack Obama near the end of the primary. So, but the way that the media was reporting on it in 2016 was showing Hillary Clinton with this huge lead from superdelegates that hadn't even actually voted yet to support Hillary Clinton. So it gave this impression that Hillary Clinton from the start had this insurmountable lead, and that a vote for Bernie Sanders is a complete waste because he can't win anyways because of all these superdelegates. But again, the media was not making it clear that these superdelegates could switch their support near the end of the primary process. But again, Bernie's focus was on states that he had won.
And there's no way in hell that any of the superdelegates would switch sides from any of the corporate candidates, including Elizabeth Warren, over to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is never going to get a majority of the superdelegates, no matter what happens.
And you see Elizabeth Warren here, I mean, in every part of this, but like at the end saying the person with the most votes should win. Yes, they should. So why the hell are you in the race when you're hitting third place, fourth place? You're not winning any states. Like, what is Elizabeth Warren's argument for superdelegates when she's not winning any states? She's not even coming in second. Like, what is her actual argument here?
There's still so many people supporting Elizabeth, and I just don't get it. So remember that Elizabeth said in the Nevada caucus, as they went down the line, she said that we should honor the process, that superdelegates ought to be allowed to wade in the second round, and that Bernie was part of the rules-making procedure that allowed them to wade in the second round. But in this clip, she just said that the people with the most votes, that the candidate with the most votes should be allowed to win. So she's talking out of both sides of her mouth, again, and again, and again.
That has announced they will be spending $9 million in television ads on your behalf. It's called a She Persists Super PAC. Now, you have been incredibly critical of super PACs. You've been incredibly critical of the role of big money in politics. I want to read you something that you tweeted just in February. You said, "Let me be clear. I won't take a dime of PAC money in this campaign. I won't take a single check from a federal lobbyist or billionaires who want to run a super PAC on my behalf." What happened?
So look, I have been in the same position since I started in January of last year, and that is we should keep super PACs and unlimited spending out of this campaign. I called on everybody, join me in this, make this happen, please, please, please. And nobody would do it. And we could shut down super PACs tonight if all of the candidates would agree. We're not going to do super PACs, but I also have to add, that also includes Michael Bloomberg, who is a walking, talking super PAC. We could shut down unlimited spending. We just all have to decide to do it, and that's what I still want to do.
But there's a little bit of a transparency issue, it strikes me. So you made an announcement and you came on my show and said, look, I'm not going to do big, high-dollar fundraisers. I think it's corrupting fundamentally. I'm going to raise money through small donations over the internet. I'm not going to do a super PAC. But now you have a situation where you are raising grassroots money. There's a super PAC. We don't know who's donating. I have no idea who came up with the $9 million. Is it one person? Is it a few rich people that want to see you elected? If you were doing high-dollar fundraisers, we'd at least have the names under federal finance law. Like, isn't that a problem? We don't know where this money comes from.
Look, and I've already said they should put out who their donors are, and they should do it before Super Tuesday. I think that's right. But understand this, Chris. This is something that we could solve. When I ran in 2012, my Republican opponent and I agreed we were going to keep super PAC money out of the race. But it takes everybody to be doing on the same level playing field. And I still think that's the right way to do it. But when you're talking about super PACs, you got to get everybody, plus Michael Bloomberg and his unlimited spending. That's the way I think it ought to work. And I still think that's the way it ought to work.
Comparing the $9 million of Elizabeth's super PAC, which could be funded by Bloomberg for all we know, to Our Revolution, the super PAC that operates on behalf of Bernie Sanders, it's not actually a super PAC. It's a 501c4. It's not the same at all in terms of the money. I've been looking for the article. I'll link to it underneath if I can find it. Okay, I found the Sludge article that talks about comparing Bernie's funding to those of the other candidates. Sludge fact check. Does Bernie Sanders get support from big money super PACs? Elizabeth Warren lumped Sanders in with fellow contenders who are getting millions of dollars worth of help from outside groups funded by corporate executives. By Alex Koch. Asked whether billionaires should be allowed to spend colossal amounts of their own money in the Democratic presidential primary, Senator Elizabeth Warren said no. In her answer, she wagered that she and Senator Amy Klobuchar were the only two candidates on stage who are running without the support from wealthy super PAC donors. I heard everyone here talking about, as Democrats, we all want to overturn Citizens United because we want to end this unlimited spending, she said. Yeah, except everyone on this stage except Amy and me is either a billionaire or is receiving help from PACs that can do unlimited spending. So if you really want to live where you say, then put your money where your mouth is and say no to the PACs. Her Twitter account tweeted out the highlight, implying that by PACs she meant super PACs. The full text of her answer is here. Go ahead and click on that later if you'd like. While the statement may be technically true, not all super PACs are the same. In fact, there's a wide chasm between super PACs backing 3 Democratic candidates, each funded with 6-figure donations from wealthy finance executives, and the super PACs backing Sanders, which consist of a nurses' unions PAC and a coalition of progressive organizations that represent over 2 million working-class people of color. This is a quotation by Natalia Salgado, political director at Center for Popular Democracy Action. When evaluating independent expenditures, one must ask the question, is this effort meant to keep power in the hands of billionaires and the corporate elite, or is it meant to bring people who have been historically left out of the political system in? It's ridiculous to lump groups like Sunrise in with billionaire-funded super PACs, Stephen O'Hanlon, communications director of the youth-led climate group The Sunrise Movement, which is backing Sanders, told Sludge. Unlike PACs set up by billionaires to blanket the airwaves with attack ads, Sunrise and the other groups we're working with represent working people, young people, and people of color. These absurd attacks seem like a sign of desperation, and they're backfiring, he continued. Voters can see right through them, and they are only making our members and people like them, the young people, working class people, and people of color Warren and Buttigieg need to win, more and more skeptical of their campaigns. Brianna Joy Gray, National Press Secretary for the Sanders campaign, tweeted that Warren's line was a misrepresentation of Sanders' support. Misrepresentations like these are why Bernie, not anyone else on that stage, is the most trusted senator in Congress. The Sanders campaign declined to comment for this story. In a Meet the Press interview with Chuck Todd on February 9th, Sanders reiterated that he does not want help from outside groups, but he was clear about who makes up these groups. Some of these are nurses, some of them are immigration activists, and some of them are civil rights activists, Sanders said. Todd asked if Sanders would accept the help since it's already out there, and the candidate answered, "It's legal. What can I do? People have the right to participate in the political process." First, let's take a look at the super PACs backing Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Andrew Yang. These are the type of well-funded super PACs that Sanders and Warren often rail against. PACs that welcome huge donations from corporate executives to purchase barrages of TV ads that are sometimes difficult for viewers to distinguish from official campaign content. Biden Super PAC, $6.8 million spent. The pro-Joe Biden super PAC, Unite the Country, got the green light from Team Biden in October after underwhelming fundraising in the third quarter of 2019, reversing Biden's earlier decision to disavow outside support. As Sludge has reported, the super PAC is run by lobbyists, corporate consultants, and Democratic Party fundraisers. Financing the super PAC are real estate mogul George Marcus, who gave $1 million, Beacon Capital Chairman Alan Leventhal, $250,000, investment banking executive Roger Altman, $200,000, BLS Investments Chairman and CEO Bernard Schwartz, $100,000, Blair Efron, co-founder and partner of Centerview Partners, the investment banking firm that hired former Chicago Mayor and Obama Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel last year, $50,000, and Jonathan Gray, president of Blackstone Real Estate, $50,000. Unite the Country spent over $5.5 million backing Biden in Iowa, where the former vice president appears to have stumbled, placing fourth, although final results have not yet been released. It is also spending money on ads in New Hampshire, according to FEC filings. The PAC has spent close to $1.3 million there, as well as $45,000 in Nevada. Unite the Country has spent additional money on fundraising, consulting, and on focus groups. Buttigieg Super PAC, $1.7 million spent. Veterans political group Vote Vets endorsed Pete Buttigieg, and its Super PAC is spending millions to help him win the nomination. I have alleged that this is a CIA-backed organization. According to a recent FEC filing, the Vote Vets Super PAC has spent $1.7 million so far on TV and digital ads backing the former South Bend, Indiana mayor. Vote Vets is a carry committee, a hybrid arrangement in which a group operates a traditional PAC subject to donation limits and a super PAC that can accept unlimited cash. The traditional PAC has accepted maximum contributions of $5,000 from the corporate PACs of Cigna, Dell, Fresenius Medicare Care, Edison International, General Dynamics, and Pfizer, as well as from several labor union groups. The top individual donors to Vote Vets Super PAC in the 2019-20 election cycle are private equity executive Brian Sheth, who gave $100,000, and national security consultant Matthew Jones, who added $50,000. Vote Vets and the Buttigieg campaign have been straining campaign finance laws in the last week. A campaign staffer tweeted what some interpreted as a directive to outside advertisers to hit the Nevada airwaves with messages of Buttigieg's military service. This is a tactic that some campaigns, barred from coordinating with super PACs, have used to communicate with outside groups. Then Buttigieg spoke at a New Hampshire event arranged in part by Vote Vets Action Fund, an affiliated 501c4 nonprofit. The Action Fund is openly working with the Buttigieg campaign, but the organization told Sludge that it maintains a staffing firewall between the super PAC and nonprofit. I'm going to skip the part about Yang because that's not relevant now. The pro-Sanders groups. It's unclear which pro-Sanders organizations Warren was referring to when she said that only she and Klobuchar were running without super PAC support. The Warren campaign did not respond to Sludge's requests for comment. Some, including myself, assumed she was referring to the super PAC of National Nurses Union, a California-based union. Others thought she meant Our Revolution, which is a 501c4 nonprofit, not a super PAC. Still more theorized that she may have been referring to 9 supporting organizations, mostly small operations representing young and working class people and people of color. Perhaps she meant all of these groups. Let me remind you, just a few minutes ago, I showed you how she is accepting money from super PACs. $9 million from one. So I'll let you read the rest about National Nurses United and how they operate, Sunrise Movement, Dream Defenders, Center for Popular Democracy Action, People's Action, and Our Revolution, also a 501c4 nonprofit. It's disingenuous to equate Bernie Sanders with Michael Bloomberg in terms of dark money, or to yourself, Elizabeth. It's just not right. We can see through you. We can see what you're trying to do. We know that you're only in it to block Bernie. And the sooner you drop out and give your delegates to Bernie, the better. Who knows, maybe by tomorrow, South Carolina will have handed it to Bernie and the race then will be nearly a wrap. Let's hope so. You have smelled fishy from the last election cycle and you smell even worse now. So the sooner you drop out, the better for our democracy. Get on board the Bernier bus train. Come get on board the Bernier bus train. Once you hear that clickety-clack, there ain't no time for turning back. Go get on board the Bernier bus train. The preceding episode can be viewed on the YouTube channel Bernie or Bust Television.